Shalom Havarim. Hello, friends. Can you believe it just happened that children's story lined up with that scripture reading? Totally by accident. Oh, I heard a story the other day about this contest that they were having at a local store in a mall. You remember what malls are? Okay, they had this contest at this store, and the contest was whoever could put on the most articles of clothing in 1 minute got to take those clothes home for free. So these two people were in this contest, and they were trying to put on as much clothes as possible. The contest began, and it's pretty close, but the first contestant number 1, was clearly leading the event. He was clearly winning. But as the minute got close to an end, as they were winding down, the contestant number 2 began catching up. And just as time expired, he grabbed this article of clothing and wrapped it around his neck, and the buzzer sounded, and they ended up being dead even. That's right. It was a tie. Round his neck. Okay. Want. I mean, I'm so far away I can't hear you laughing. That's the problem. All right. Well, actually, that's my second tie joke in like the last 6 months. I mean, come on now. How many tie jokes do you know? Actually, I'm wondering, let's be honest here, folks. We are here, this is church. We are in church even though we're not indoors. This is a gathering of God's people, of believers in Christ. Anytime 2 or 3 are gathered, we are doing church. And how many of you arrived at church this morning and you saw me and you said, what in the world is that guy wearing? How many of you saw me and said, where can I get one of those shirts? All right. My Hawaiian brother from another mother said, where did you get that? Actually, I was kind of thinking that maybe you would wear a Hawaiian shirt. Yes. For you, it's a part of your culture. For me, it's a cultural appropriation, I guess. But either way, if you'll forgive me, a little grace, please. We're talking about what we wear in church today. And not only what we wear in church, what is okay to wear outside of church. This is a part of my sermon series that I'm beginning on the essentials of church. As we come out of the pandemic, as we kind of move into whatever is next for the church, we're asking questions about what is and is not necessary. So I want to be asking questions about what is biblical and what is just cultural. And if it is biblical, I think biblical principles are supposed to stand for all time. I think that this was meant to be God's teaching even in the 21st century, not only when God first uttered these words. But if it is cultural, we can make changes. If it's cultural, we can make adjustments, and we can follow culture as long as it doesn't stand in opposition to what God has said. So today we're going to be asking questions about what we wear. Is it okay for women to wear pants? Is it okay for men to wear dresses? Oh. Is it okay to wear shorts in church? Is it okay to wear hats in church? Is it okay to braid your hair and wear jewelry? All of these are biblical. Well, not all of them are biblical. All of these are teachings about dress that we have found throughout the history of the church. We're going to explore some of those things. We're going to ask again the questions, is it biblical or is it cultural? I guess I want to start with a little bit of background information. We're going to turn the clocks back all the way to 2003. I know for some of us it doesn't sound like that far ago, and some of you are like, I wasn't even born then. But 2003 is when I began my first professional pastoral role. I was 23 years old. Let me just tell you all, I'm going to admit, you don't know anything when you're 23 years old. How many of you out there would say amen to that? I kind of like the handheld one. And when you're 23, you don't know anything, but what you do know, at least what I knew, was that I wasn't always taken seriously because I was even goofier back then. So a 23-year-old with his first position in the church, people didn't see me as the pastor, and sometimes I was even called the youth pastor. I've never been a youth pastor. I remember, and I have utmost respect for youth pastors, but I remember going to visit this old dude. His name was Francis Smucker. 90-some years old. I wasn't going to say his name, but now I have. Francis Smucker, 90-some years old, was a part of our church, and I would go visit him in the nursing home, and he often had visitors there. Actually, that's where I met Kathy's father for the first time. Visiting Francis Smucker, and he would always introduce me to the nurses or the staff or the visitors that were there. And he would always introduce me as the youth pastor. I'm like, Francis, you are 90-something years old. Why am I here visiting you if I'm the youth pastor? So I'm a youthful pastor. That's different. So from day one, when I started in that church, every time I would go into church on Sunday, I would always make sure to wear a tie. Because a tie was a symbol of power and authority. It was a symbol that I was somebody important. What I had to say mattered. And I continued to wear a tie to church every Sunday. I went from that church to another church before I came to Virginia. And I started at Stanton Mennonite Church in 2006. I was then a 26-year-old. And you just don't know much more as a 26-year-old. But as a 26-year-old at Stanton Mennonite Church, I realized that I still needed to wear a tie every Sunday. It was a matter of showing that I was mature. A matter of showing that I had some kind of authority. And I wasn't the only one that wore a tie. Many of the people in this congregation that have been around for that long, the men wore ties as well. But then time went by and we started attracting some younger people to our congregation. And I remember very clearly, one Sunday, a young man, not young man, I should say a person about my age at that time, showed up to church wearing shorts. And no, it wasn't you, Tate. I know you have your own story. But a guy came to church wearing shorts. And it just caught me so off guard. And it's like, you're a grown man wearing shorts in church. Is that okay? And actually, a few months later, I'll call Glenn out on this. Glenn and I were having a conversation then. And he said about the people that were coming to our church, he noticed that the young people that were coming in, he says, I see these people in the community. And they dress nicer for work than they dress at church. And some of you are here today. That's so blessed. And I realized that's true. And it's at that point that I said, well, maybe I don't need to wear a tie every Sunday. I maybe had some sort of maturity, some sort of established respect at that point. But I think most of all, I just didn't want to put on a tie every Sunday. That's part of it. I got tired of looking back, which tie did I wear last week? And I just decided I wasn't going to wear a tie anymore. And you know what happened? A lot of the rest of you stopped wearing ties too. It's very rare that I wear a tie. Maybe Easter Sunday I'll wear a tie. Now there's nothing in the world wrong with wearing a tie, but it's not really who I am. And I think it doesn't really reflect the people to whom I am ministering. So today I wore this shirt for the second time ever. And I realized that a Hawaiian shirt maybe doesn't represent who I am, but I know that there are a lot of pastors that wear Hawaiian shirts every Sunday. You've heard of Rick Warren, Saddleback Church out in California. He's the guy that wrote the Purpose-Driven Church. Every Sunday, Rick Warren wears a Hawaiian shirt because that's the style that the people are wearing around him. It's a way of connecting with people, a way of making them feel comfortable and making them feel like they are invited and welcome in that church. So I realize this as I'm reading through today's scripture, and this passage from James talks about how a guy comes into the congregation, he's wearing this fancy suit. He's wearing the Gucci or the Versace, and he's got the golden rings, and everybody sees this guy, and what do you think of this guy wearing the power suit? Oh, he's important. This guy matters. But somebody else walks into the congregation and they're wearing these old clothes, they're ragged clothes, they've got holes in the jeans, which I guess is cool again, I don't know. Holes in the jeans, and they got the stinky shirt with maybe a stain on it. They have that ketchup stain from the food they had last night for supper. And people start to judge these people, don't they? You see the one guy, you think instantly, there's power, there's authority, there's wealth. This guy matters. On the other end of the spectrum, you say, well, this guy's poor. Insignificant. I don't even need to speak to this guy. He smells. I don't want to come close to him. And in James, they're saying this differentiation has no place in the church. We aren't to have this hierarchy of power and authority and worth and value. And these items of clothing can be a divider between the classes. He's saying, just come. Wear whatever you're comfortable with. But don't try to look like you're more important, more powerful. Now, I've heard people say, and I don't know how accurate it is, but I've heard people say, I would come to church, but I don't have anything to wear. I don't have nice enough clothes to go to church. And part of me wants to say that's probably just an excuse. But let's be honest, if there's any truth to that at all, if somebody isn't willing to come to church because they don't think they have nice enough clothes to wear, then we as a church have significantly missed the point. I want to say that the phrase Sunday best, your Sunday best, is not in the Bible. If you can give me a chapter and verse reference, I'll gladly say I'm wrong. But that is not biblical. That is cultural. Okay, and I also wanted to say before I got started, it's too late now. I want to say, often whenever I preach, I'll say something like, it's okay if you disagree with me. But today is especially so. Today is more so. If you disagree with what I say, that's okay. We can still get along together. We can still love one another. If you think you need to wear a suit and tie every Sunday, that is fine. But just know that I don't think that is biblical. That is more cultural. All right, well, let's take it another notch. Let's get a little more intense here, a little more biblical on this as well. Because I remember growing up and hearing this passage read to me from the pulpit. Deuteronomy 22:5. You all know Deuteronomy 22:5, right? Deuteronomy 22:5 says, a woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing. For the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. God said it, I believe it. That's good enough for me, right? No, I grew up in a very conservative Anabaptist church, and it was expected of every woman, everyone who was a member of that church, again, every woman that was a member of that church, to wear a skirt or a dress. And not only to worship, but also outside of the church, even at home. I assume like people, whenever they're doing their dishes or vacuuming, they're doing so in their skirt, in their dress. Because the teaching of the church was women are not to wear men's clothing, and pants are men's clothing. I never heard the flip side. I never heard anybody say a man can't wear a dress or a skirt because that's a woman's dress or women's clothing. But I assume that if somebody tried to walk into a dress with that kind of clothing on, they might say something as well. But I actually found something this week. I found it very interesting. It turns out that in our house we have an artifact. This is an authentic piece of clothing from back in Moses' day, back when Moses would have gotten this law from God himself. This is exactly the sort of thing that Moses would have worn when he received the Torah. Are you ready for this? Oh, reversible. Authentic. What? It looks like a robe. This is authentic Mosaic garb right here. It's vintage. So this is what Moses would have worn back in his day, back when he received the Torah. Okay, interestingly enough, this week I also got a piece of authentic women's clothing from the same time period. You want to see that one as well? Looks a lot the same, doesn't it? That took more work than it was worth. All right. The point I'm trying to make is, back in Moses' day, when Moses got the law, men and women dressed an awful lot alike. And you know what their clothes looked like? Looked a lot more like what women wear. It looks a lot more like a dress than what a traditional man might wear. It looks a lot more like a dress than these pants that I'm wearing. Not only Moses wore this, guess who else wore this? Jesus himself wore a robe. Now, I thought about this a little bit, and the more I thought about it, I realized that when you read that passage, a man should not wear women's clothes, and women should not wear men's clothes, something else must be going on. And the more research I did, there's always those people that have very conservative takes on it and say, obviously a woman should not wear pants because this is men's clothes. You are being detestable in God's eyes. But there's more to it than that. Most scholars will agree, and I'm sorry, we're going to get a little bit PG-13 at times here today. Most scholars will agree that when Moses received this law from God, he's referring to a temple prostitute system among the pagan nations around them. It would have been common for the pagan nations to go to the temple prostitute, and they had this service where they would switch clothes with one another. When I talked about a man wearing a woman's clothes, it wasn't like buying something a woman might wear at the Gap. It was about actually exchanging with the woman. So this was about avoiding these pagan rituals and acts. And if you think about where this was located, this is in Deuteronomy chapter 22. This is a part of the holiness codes. In the holiness codes, it names a number of acts that are just kind of weird to us. It says, don't do these things. Well, the reason for those is because this is what pagan nations were doing, and they didn't want the Israelites mixing with the pagan ways. If you look at just like a couple of chapters earlier, you have things like don't plant two kinds of seed in one field. You have don't make two different kinds of animals. I think it's just 3 verses later in today's passage, you have this thing that says, don't wear a piece of clothing made of 2 cloths. And it goes on to say, make sure that the corners of your robe have 4 long fringes or tassels on them. Now, how many of you out there are wearing poly cotton blend shirts? I have no idea what mine's made of, probably rayon. I don't see any tassels on your garments today. So we don't believe that still applies to today. So why would we take a verse just 3 verses earlier, take it out of its context, take it out of its original meaning, and try to apply that to make women wear skirts all the time? I mean, I remember women, we had to invent something called skirts, just so women could play sports. You remember this, right? Well, there's another name for it. Someone help me out. Culottes, thank you. Like, we had to invent these things because of this passage. Like, so girls could play sports and still have their everything covered. Moving quickly. And I remember very clearly that one time I was in a church service, and a gentleman came into the back door, and he was a part of the service. It was planned, and he had bagpipes. He began playing Amazing Grace. It was absolutely beautiful. It was a tear-moving event. It was at a wedding, actually, and the groom starts tearing up. And you know what the man was wearing as he played the bagpipes? He's wearing a kilt. Should I have stopped that guy right then and said, "You sinner"? Let us remember that this is more cultural than biblical. Yes, the text says that a man should not wear women's clothes and women should not wear men's clothes, but in those days, those clothes looked an awful lot alike, and they didn't look like what we're wearing today. So let's be careful when we try to apply that in today's world. All right, well, that brings me to the last point that I want to make this morning, and this is the controversial one. You ready for this, Asher? No. No, it may make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. Again, I have to go a little PG-13 on this one, but now it's time to talk about modesty. Ooh, modesty. Modesty, we read about modesty a number of times throughout the New Testament, and in one place, 1 Timothy chapter 2:9 is one of the go-tos for teaching on modesty. And 1 Timothy 2:9 says this, "I also want the women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes." You've heard that before? So Paul is talking to Timothy. Make sure the women dress modestly. Make sure they are decent. Make sure they dress with propriety, whatever that means. And he gives some examples. What were those examples? Right, no crazy hair, no pearls, no gold. Now that's not what I normally think of when I think of modesty, but in Paul's day, those were the issues that he was dealing with. And I'm looking out there again. Anybody have fancy hair? I mean, I grew up in the 80s where the women had the hair up here. You know, the higher the hair, the closer you are to Jesus. So I grew up with this, and pearls. My Aunt Mabel had pearls and gold. The only gold I own is a ring, but sometimes I wear that. Anybody out there wearing gold today? You immodest people. No, the point that I'm trying to make is, once again, that this is cultural. Now, I need to take one step back and say, I do believe modesty is biblical. But how we interpret modesty changes with culture. And I'm going to use an extreme example. It's an example you're not going to forget. And I hesitate to use it again because this is going to be PG-13. But again, I'm going to make my point, and you're going to remember it. My friend Claire Good is the pastor at Waynesboro Mennonite Church. And Claire, for a number of years, was a missionary in Kenya. He worked among the Maasai tribe in Kenya, in Africa. And if you know much about that part of the world, or if you've ever read through National Geographic, you know that the women usually go around topless. So imagine that you are a young missionary from Pennsylvania, a Mennonite missionary coming from Pennsylvania. You go into Nairobi, Kenya, and all of the women are now topless. You can imagine how this may be slightly distracting. Yeah. Asher's listening now. So one day, Claire goes to the tribal elder, and he sits down and talks with him. This is a normal thing. And Claire just admits, this is an issue for him. He says to the elder, he says, tell me, why do your women go around naked? They expose their breasts in public. And the elder, without missing a beat, turns it around and he says, why do your women go around naked in public? They expose their legs in public. You see, in the Kenyan concept, in their understanding, the breasts were not sexualized. What was the thigh of the woman. So this elder had seen pictures from women in America, and they had shorts that came above the knee. And for him, that was seen as pornographic. To that Maasai leader, the exposed breast was nothing. That was just normal. So you see where I'm trying to go with this, right? I want to say absolutely, modesty is a biblical principle. But how we discern what is and is not modest is cultural. It will vary from one community to another, from one country to another, from one part of the United States to another. What you might be able to do in one part of the United States, say up in the north versus the Bible Belt, could be vastly different. It's a matter of being aware of your surrounding, your culture, and your community. But let's push this out a little bit more. So again, don't hear me saying that modesty is not important. Modesty is very important. But let's think about what Jesus said about this matter. Often we hear men, and men, I'm kind of talking to you here. Often we hear men talking about how women cause them to stumble. How men see women and they see these beautiful people and they begin to lust. Now let's be very honest here. For some of my friends, if you saw a woman walking down the road in a burlap sack, you probably whistle at them, right? May hear some cat calls. You know some people like that, right, Roger? Some people, it doesn't really take much. But what does Jesus say about this whole event? What does he say? In Matthew 5:28-29, he says this, "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." Now, when we think about Jesus talking about lust and talking about modesty here, notice that he's not putting the impetus upon the woman. He's not blaming, nor is he shaming women. He's not saying, if your eye causes you to lust, go cause that woman to cover up. He doesn't say, if you lust for a woman, go tell her to obey the laws and put on longer pants or longer shorts or raise her neckline. Jesus puts that on the man. If you find yourself lusting for another person, it's on you to do something about it. Don't blame her. Blame your eye. Go as far as plucking your eye out if you must. Stop blaming. Stop shaming. And men, take responsibility for yourself. Now again, I'm not saying that modesty is unimportant. Modesty is very important. But we men have a role in this as well. All right, so I want to conclude this morning with a little bit of good news. And I know that was a bit of a downer. I thought you could have a little fun with that one, but all right, that was a downer. Guys, like, gosh, I have to take care of myself now. I got more work to do. Let's end on a good note, okay? All right. I believe, and I want to go on record as saying that we in the Mennonite Church have for too long worried about clothing. We go back in the history of the Mennonite Church and we see things like cape dresses and plain jackets. Whether we wear ties or don't wear ties. We get so caught up in all of this that we seem to actually miss the point. We can argue about whether girls have to wear skirts or culottes, or if there's even a difference between the two, while they're playing sports. But again, I think this misses the point altogether. I'm going to take Jesus a little out of context here, but in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, don't worry about your body, about your clothes, about what you'll wear. And in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, God's talking through Samuel. They're trying to pick out the next leader for the Israelites. And God says, God does not look upon what's on the outside. God looks upon the heart. God looks upon what's inside. Once again, I'm not saying that clothes are unimportant. I'm not saying that modesty doesn't matter. What I'm saying is God cares less about what we wear than what's inside. God cares less about what you wear to church than that you come to church. This is about coming together to support one another, to love one another equally, across spectrums, across beliefs, across affluence and power. It's about coming together to support one another and to lift up Jesus in praise. And it's my hope that we can do that. So what are we to wear to church? Whatever you feel comfortable in. Try to be aware of how others might see it. Will it be a distraction if I wear a Hawaiian shirt? Maybe, maybe not. But I don't think that's really important. God looks upon what's inside. Now today is actually known as World Communion Day. The first Sunday of every month is designated as such. The first month of October every year is designated as such. So if you have your communion elements,